Welcome to the Ellevate podcast, conversations with women changing the face of business. And now your hosts, Kristy, Wallace, and Maricella, Herrera.
Hello and welcome to the Ellevate podcast. This is your host, Kristy Wallace, with my co-host, Maricella, Herrera. Maricella, you are going to love our guest today.
Tell me all about her.
So we have Chloe Carmichael.
Who's I know Chloe well.
I know you do. Near and dear friend of Ellevate Network and longtime member. And she's here to share with us many of her learnings around just anxiety and how we best manage that, particularly in the environment in which we're in. She just came out with a book, and she's got great insights to share with all of our listeners about navigating these times, especially from a place of mental health and well-being.
You know, I'm really passionate about the topic of mental health, and particularly mental health within organizations, and also in not making it taboo. I think it's important to know that people are not alone. I mean, 1 in 5 people suffer from a mental health disorder in their lifetimes, and during this pandemic, that number has increased. We're all really going through a lot. The burnout is real. The stress is real. The having been, a year in this high alert status is real. So not to mention the loneliness, the fear, the grief, blah, blah, blah. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Chloe has to say. I know she's great at what she does, and it's going to be an interesting conversation where she can share some tips. I've known her for a while, and I think she's fantastic.
Yes, I was thinking about her because one of her tips is she talks about taking hot showers. So I guess this is weird to say on a podcast, but I was showering the other day and I thought of Chloe, and I was like, "Oh, this is supposed to." Well, I think it should stimulate your adrenal gland or something, and kind of causes you to relax. And so, Chloe, if you're listening to this, I was thinking about you.
In the shower. It is weird for you to say that, but I will be honest, we've had listeners to the podcast who tell us they listen to us in the shower, and yeah, it's kind of weird, but also kind of flattering.
Hey, we gotta make the most of our time, however we do it. And I listen to my podcasts when I'm out walking, but I know friends who listen when they are cooking dinner, and others when they're going to bed at night. What about you, Maricella? When do you get your podcast time in?
Depends on the podcast. So I listen to true crime podcasts when I run, but true crime with comedians, not serious. That's my running stuff. Then I do listen to when I shower or bathe, because the running thing, the Epsom salts are my friend lately. I listen to interviews or funny stuff when I do that, and when I cook. Yeah. And the more serious, intellectual TED Talk or that kind of thing is when I walk.
All right. I love it. And you're going to have to tell me more about true crime with comedians at some point, because that definitely piqued my interest.
Oh my God, it's the best.
All right. Let's get to my conversation with Dr. Chloe Carmichael. Dr. Chloe, it is so exciting to have you joining us today on the Ellevate podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Kristy. I really can't believe it to be here with you talking about a book. It seems like just yesterday that I was joining as a junior member back when you guys were 85 Frauds. It's so exciting to be here with you now.
Yeah, I agree. We've been a part of the Ellevate community for quite some time. And the thing that we love to see is just the progress, the growth, the successes of those in our community. It really goes to show how much we lean into these connections and to the insights and learnings from each other. You've been a huge leader for a number of years, sharing your learnings and experiences to help all of us move forward, and particularly in the past year and during this time of pandemic. So thank you for all of your contributions.
Yeah, it's been such a pleasure. We were talking a moment ago about what I had done previously, which I know was the goal attainment talk. But then you're right. I think there was actually another talk that I did maybe a year ago, I think, as you said, about boundaries and things like that as well. There's just so many topics that Elevate touches on that I love as well. So it's just so good to be with you today.
So, Chloe, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and story with our community to kind of set the stage for the conversation we're going to have today?
Sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm also a small business owner. So, as a clinical psychologist, I do private sessions with people, but then I also employ other therapists that do private sessions as well. And I recently actually took a sabbatical from taking any new clients because my book is coming out in just a couple weeks. Nervous Energy: Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. And that book also recently got an endorsement from Deepak Chopra. So it's been getting some media attention, which has been taking my attention. I'm working on courses and things like that. Just as a business person, it's been an interesting journey for me going on the one-to-one side of just doing therapy one-to-one and then branching it out into a one-to-many where I can take, my perspectives and start sharing them with people and organizations on broader levels with whether it be consulting or different types of courses. So it's been such a wild ride, but again, for me, Elevate has been such a nice home base throughout the years, like really just at various different stages of career where I've been, whether it's just be from the very most junior, and it was so exciting for me just to be around C-suite women that would actually talk to me and kind of, mentor me a little bit. And then finding myself, rising up those ranks and feeling welcomed and embraced by those same women as a peer.
So you talked about being a small business owner, and I'm curious because I think this is something so many of us, whether we're leading a team in a P&L or our own businesses, are struggling with during this time, which is, pushing ourselves to continue to learn and to grow, understanding where to focus our energies. How do we continue to go after those goals that we have? So for you, running your business and your practice, and then now you are negotiating a book deal, you're doing public speaking, you're, creating partnerships and in the news. Like, how did you scale up or scale to build those skills and to set yourself up for success?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of one little baby step at a time, but a big one for me was, and I do share about this in the book a little bit too, is I gave myself a schedule. So right from the start, when I started my own business, I gave myself a 40-hour a week work schedule where I had to come to the office and work either on seeing clients if I had them or figuring out how to get them if I didn't have clients, enough for that day. So just being dedicated and having always a to-do list of I would always keep multiple to-do lists, some for what I call kind of brainless activities, like when you just feel maybe like browsing the internet and, doing whatever stuff is more brainless for you. And then other stuff that was a little bit more thought intensive for me, like, creating a newsletter or those types of things. And the idea was just that during those 40 hours, as long as I was doing something on one of my to-do lists, then I knew I was going to be making progress. And that was so important because I was so anxious. I was so nervous, rightfully so afraid that I was not going to succeed. It would have been pompous, I think, for me to expect I could just open up a shop and just be successful. So I think it was rightly placed that I was nervous. But that's kind of also the point of the book is that nervous energy is actually a gift as long as we make sure that it's focused at something. So, specifically what I did to answer your question of, starting to get media attention and book deals and stuff like that, I just started with the website Herrera, Help a Reporter Out. And I would just provide quotes on there to journalists that were looking for something and learning how to just, limit myself to no more than 5 or 10 minutes per quote. And then I started getting little quotes. And then whenever the media would call. I got my first TV breakthrough when VH1 called. They needed a psychologist to talk about a relationship issue. But the idea is just that whenever the media calls, you say yes. And then you always follow up with the journalists and, send them your holiday cards, have that newsletter to just always stay in front of them. I mean, I got really aggressive about it too. Whenever I would get a quote at first in the media, I would put it on my Facebook, my business Facebook, and then I would market it. I would click promote the post, and I would specifically market it to anybody that was in New York media and television if I had a really good clip, to make sure that, whatever producers were on Facebook that day, that hopefully they would see my clip. I got really aggressive about it, but I think it worked because now that I have this book deal, the publisher is actually pretty impressed. They said we're actually pretty surprised. Like, you have this list of hundreds of journalists, and they're all writing back to us when we talk about your book. So it was never anything I had planned, but it just worked out well.
So I love this story, and I appreciate that you're sharing very tangible, actionable tips. These are relevant, I think, for any of us looking to raise our profile as a professional or as a business owner. How did you talk about that to-do list and that 40-hour week to-do list? I mean, do you have specific tips that you utilized for managing the to-do list and staying on task? I
Sure.
was in a thread with another group where we were talking about that, like what's everyone's, hack for that? And I'm curious what yours is.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things, and I share in the book as well, that I think is so important is called the to-do list with emotions. And the reason for that is because a lot of us high functioning type A driven people will have these to-do lists, and then we can almost start to get like a hamster on a wheel type of a feeling where we're just slogging through the list, but we can almost lose our sense of connection with it, or we get disconnected to the point where we start procrastinating. And so, what we need to do then is look at the to do list and ask ourselves, what's the emotion that's coming up for whatever the items are where we're getting stuck or not connecting. And the emotions can be surprising, but the benefit of getting in touch with the emotions, even if they're challenging, is that then we can practice self-care. So, for example, I was working with somebody that was struggling to just get her gym bag to work with her, and then so that she could go to the gym after work, and she just wasn't getting it done. And like a lot of high functioning people, she was really hard on herself, which it's good to have high standards, but we can get so hard on ourselves that it can be demotivating. So she was really beating herself up about, never bringing that gym bag, that to-do list item. And when we asked what's the emotion on that item, it was actually shame, because the, clothes didn't fit her and she felt like it was going to be frivolous and indulgent to buy new gym clothes, and because she could just, make the old ones work. But it turned out that she was actually really struggling with that because they really didn't fit her properly. It was causing a lot of embarrassment and shame that didn't need to be there. And so by just choosing to treat herself a little bit and get some, gym clothes that fit her, then she was actually able to get past that emotional hang up on the to-do list. So we do want to look at the to-do list and think about the emotions around those things, because the emotions can actually be obstacles or sources of energy if we let them.
Well, and then on that note, let's talk about boundaries, because many of us, when you talk about these, high functioning type A, and I'm not going to lie, I associate with that very very intimately. But we have big dreams, lots to do. We're navigating work and our goals, our personal health and wellness, relationships, potentially caregiving, or other activities, hobbies, boards. And I don't say all of this to stress any of our listeners out, but it's top of mind for me, which is, how to manage all of that, particularly in the last year where I think boundaries seemed much less clearly defined. And we have our to-dos and we want to move forward. What are ways in which to set those boundaries? Back to what you were saying earlier, Chloe, with the 40-hour week with your to-dos. I mean, I may think it's 40 hours and then at the end of the week realize it was 60 or 70. I mean, it just feels
Mhm.
like things never end. So how do you
Yeah.
set boundaries?
So, I mean, I will say that I've certainly worked my share of 60-hour weeks. And for me, it's oftentimes a labor of love, right? So I think the key is to make sure when it comes to those boundaries around work is that you are calling the shots and that you realize that. Now, I recognize that if, you're working for a corporation and say you're on a deal, there's a deal closing, you're not really calling the shots in the sense that, if the deal is closing that week and you need to be on it for 60 hours, it's not that you're really calling that shot, but you are calling the shots in the sense of that we get to choose where we work and we get to choose if the compensation or, whatever the challenges about our work that we enjoy, if those are ultimately worth it to us. So when we think about depression, the hallmark of depression is often helplessness, a sense of helplessness. So when we do think about, again, those boundaries, if we want to be working 40 hours a week and it's turning into 60, then we need to ask ourselves, is this worth it? Am I doing this with a sense of intentionality because I want to pay my dues right now? I want to immerse myself in this, and it's a little overwhelming, but I'm choosing to do that. I'm choosing to kind of eat, live, and breathe this project for a little while. But if we're actually saying no, I don't want to be doing this, then that's when we want to listen to our distress. The blessing and the curse of high functioning people is that we're actually able to override frustration, right? So frustration tolerance is a gift until it becomes more of being oblivious to the frustration. So if you were, say, putting your hand over a hot stove and you were tolerating it because there was some reason to do it, then that makes sense. But if you put your hand over the hot stove and you don't realize it, you block it out to the point where you don't realize you're getting a burn, then that's another story. So when it comes to anxiety and distress, we want to make sure we don't get so good at tolerating it and saying, I can get through this, that we lose touch with it. So if we are sensing that there's, something's got to give in terms of the work boundaries, then I think we actually owe it to ourselves to be honest and to admit maybe this isn't working. A lot of very high functioning people don't want to be perceived as a quitter. And they also are quite clear about the fact that they can. They don't ever want to think, hey, I cannot do this. And so while it may be true that you can do this, the question is, should you do this? Is this really good for me? Is this really the way that I want to be living my life? And I went through that myself at one point when, to my delight, I started actually booking more clients than I could even handle. When I first started my practice, I didn't even know if I would book enough clients to stay in business. And I had a motto, I don't say no to work. And that worked fine until I was booked so crazy I couldn't keep up, really. And it was through admitting that I was no longer doing my best work, that I couldn't do it that way and really bring my A game. That was actually what empowered me to have the good idea of hiring people. And that turned out to be a better move business wise, but certainly also a better move personally, too.
So talk to me about your book. You have a book coming out, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. And I'm curious, what drove you specifically to this topic? What was the catalyst behind you creating this resource?
Yeah, so there's a couple of answers to that, right? So the button down answer is I wrote the book because I want to make my techniques available to people that are unable to get into my office due to reasons of schedule or budget, and that's very true. The other answer as well, Kristy, which is also true, is that my practice was doing really well several years ago. It still is, but several years ago when I was first, stunned that we had cleared $1 million in revenue for the first time annually. And I was, out with a friend of mine who knows a lot about business and sharing this with her. And she said, well, Chloe, that's all well and good. But if you really want to, remain, if you really want to keep growing in the business space, and if you really want to be perceived as going to the next level, you need to write a book. She said, just so you're aware, like if you don't do it by the time you're 40, it's not going to be as strong. And I love a challenge. I'm a little competitive. So that was kind of what I needed to hear. And so I said, oh, well, all right, then I'll do it. I'll write a book. What should it be? And so, we got to thinking about it. And we thought, well, why is my practice so successful? What do we do? What do we do? And so I realized, well, what I do is I help very successful people figure out how to become even more successful. And I was tending to get a lot of people in my office that had issues with anxiety. And they were all noticing, they would kind of come in and say almost sheepishly, oh, gee, I'm a little OCD. Oh, I'm kind of a perfectionist. And the way they would almost giggle, you could tell it was almost their favorite problem. Like they didn't really want to totally get rid of it because they actually had a healthy awareness that there was something about this anxiety that was keeping them on point, that was keeping them focused, right? And so that's why I started to think of it almost as nervous energy, and that it was actually a power that just needed to be harnessed. Because when we are anxious, Mother Nature does give us a little extra boost of adrenaline, a little extra focus, and that's actually by design to help us to deal with whatever stressors that we have. So that was, I realized that that was really basically what I was doing. And so I thought about what are, say, 9 of the most popular techniques. I didn't start thinking what are 9, but I listed what are the most popular techniques that I'm always teaching people. And there were 9. So I put them in the book and I shared stories on how to do them, as well as stories about the clients and, kind of interesting stories about New Yorkers and how they were using them. And I also shared about myself, how I use the techniques on myself, just to keep it super vulnerable.
What are some of the key takeaways in your book? I don't want to give too much of away,
No, no.
but I'm,
Yeah.
please share.
Sure. I mean, the key takeaway to me, the biggest thing that I want people to know about anxiety is that it's not bad, right? I can't tell you how many times people come and they say, Chloe, how do I get rid of my anxiety? And I always want to tell them, you don't. You don't want to. You do want to learn how to manage it. But without anxiety, without just a little anxiety, we wouldn't look both ways before we cross the street, right? We wouldn't double check our purse before we left the house to make sure we've got everything we need. So that anxiety is what stimulates you to do a little double checking and that kind of stuff. That is the healthy function of anxiety. And so what I want people to know is that when you do have that little tickle of anxiety, we don't want to shout it down, or certainly we don't want to become critical of ourselves for feeling anxious. Instead, we want to say, hi, anxiety, thanks for letting me know, that you're concerned. What are you concerned about? What are you worried about? Because if we don't listen to anxiety at lower levels, that's when it has to scream and shout to get our attention. Now, a lot of people, though, they have a tendency to want to ignore it or clam up when it arises because they just don't know how to deal with it. And so that's why, the book is super practical. It has, like I said, 9 techniques that will pretty much handle just about any type of anxiety, because there are times when we're anxious and really what we need is to learn how to just calm ourselves down. I call that almost like a top down anxiety problem, where our body is almost going into a tizzy, and there's no real reason for it. We just need to learn how to calm our bodies down. But then there's other types of situations where we're anxious because of a future concern, and the anxiety is trying to stimulate us to do something about it, right? And I call that a bottom up type of anxiety situation. And both of them are valid, but we just need to first understand which type we're dealing with before we can choose the best tool. And so that's why the very first tool in the book is actually more of a mindfulness type of exercise to help you really study, like, what is this anxiety about, so that then you can choose the best tool for it.
I and I mean, you can have both of those anxieties, right? Because as you're talking, I'm like, okay, I'm, will be anxious in the moment, and then also my husband always says I like stress so much about things in the future, and like what's happening down the road. And yeah, I mean, I'll say that if you look at my desk right now, I have mindfulness cards, and I have scented oil sprays, and I'm oftentimes throughout the day just trying to stop and like take a deep breath and be more mindful and more aware. What else should I be doing?
Well, I to just it depends. Again, if you want to just really slow yourself down, there are some wonderful breathing exercises that are really good for that, for just slowing yourself down, which is actually different from being more mindful and more aware. And that's one of the things I actually talk about in the book is there's a whole section on really understanding what mindfulness is, right? So many people do find it relaxing to practice a mindfulness exercise, which makes sense because it is just all about slowing down and noticing yourself and observing yourself and having what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about yourself. And certainly people find that relaxing, but there are other exercises that are specifically geared towards relaxation, Kristy. So to answer your question, as far as like what more you should be doing, I think it would be hard to say without really knowing more like what the goals are. So if you don't mind sharing, I could be more specific, but can you tell me like more specifically what the situation is? Is it like a racing thought situation or like a looming deadline stress? If you don't mind sharing more.
Sure. Although listeners, I hope that this is relates to you and it's not just my session. But I think it's important we talk about these things. And I'll say, I'll give you one example, and there's a few different examples, and I think both of the categories of anxiety you talked about resonate with me. But part of it is today, working from home. I have my to-dos. I have all my stuff to do. And like I start the day feeling so anxious because it's like I've got meetings and I've got tasks and I've got to make lunch for kids and my kids are mommy's in mommy school, so they're home and I have to teach them and make sure they're getting their stuff done. And it just feels like there's so much on my plate. And I know we've talked a lot about learning, identifying what you can let go of and what isn't a priority. But it just feels like I immediately go into this state of just my heart racing, feeling like I'm having to take deep breaths to really calm myself. And it's like every day is like that. And I
Mhm.
don't, I'm aware of it, but it's also how do I move on from that state, because it does feel like I'm unable to. It takes me a while to feel like I'm starting to like pick up the speed and momentum around productivity, because I start just feeling so under the weight of it that I don't know, that I'm you know it's overwhelming.
Yeah, so thank you, Kristy. That's a really really rich example. I appreciate that. So, first of all, you touched on one of the things that I was thinking about when you do feel genuinely overburdened with too much to do. As you said, one of the first things from a practical standpoint that we would think about, is that healthy awareness of feeling overwhelmed schedule wise. Is that a healthy awareness that, something needs to come off of your plate? And so sometimes talking that over with somebody that's good at time management might help you to locate some areas where you actually could get something off your plate. Or, I know our time is limited. I won't get into all of it right now, but if we were in a private session, I would also be asking you, okay, how exactly old are your kids? Can they be making their own lunches? Is there, anything more, that they could be doing? So I would be thinking about that a little bit from that kind of bottom up perspective of saying, is there anything that we can do to actually change the load that you're dealing with? Because again, sometimes that awareness that of distress is actually trying to guide us very simply to just learn how to get some of the things off of our plate. Now, on the other hand, when you say, that your heart is racing and you find yourself having to take a lot of deep breaths, another a couple of other thoughts I would have would just be, one is taking deep breaths is a normal, healthy thing to do. And so it might even be that we want to normalize and kind of beautify the experience of taking some deep breaths, so that if we can reframe it, that instead of like, oh my gosh, here come the deep breaths because today is so stressful, time for my deep emergency deep breaths. You know what I mean? Like if we could even reframe them into something of like just a normal, joyful part of saying, and here's the part where my body steps in and just oxygenates me and I reconnect with, just the pleasure of what I'm doing. That would be one thing to do potentially. And then I would also personally become curious about the idea of, the heart racing. What are the beliefs around what will happen if all of this stuff doesn't get done, right? So if there's some kind of underlying framework around this of saying, if all these things don't get done, if the sandwich isn't perfect, if that call has to get bumped, then I'm not a good mom, or then I'm not doing a good job at what I'm doing. If there's that kind of negative self-talk in the background, it can make everything so much more intense. So I would also, again, we won't, do it all now, but this is the kind of thing we explore in the book would then be like, what are the thoughts around this? Would some healthy thoughts like, I am a great mom and I am a killer businesswoman and I'm modeling for my kids that life gets hectic sometimes, and that's okay if the kids see that, I'm modeling that we just keep it moving anyway, and that life doesn't have to be perfect, and that this is a chance to model that, then sometimes it has to do with the frameworks that we put around it. So just to recap then, Kristy, I think the three-pronged approach would be, number one, we'd want to look at the actual plate of stuff to see if there's anything that could be done around it. Number two, we'd want to reframe the idea of some of these breaths and like self-care strategies to hopefully feel more like enhancers rather than, rescue techniques per se. And then we'd also want to look at some of the thoughts and the beliefs around what will happen if these things aren't done, and are we making these into a life and death situation when maybe they don't have to be quite that intense.
Thank you so much for all of that. I don't know. It's just nice to feel heard and to feel less alone. And I imagine too, as we're navigating these times. You talked about how feeling like you have to be the perfect mom who's now learning how to be a teacher and homeschool your kids, or the perfect business owner or team leader who is supporting teams and businesses during a time of great unknown. There is, I mean, we don't have the rubric for that. We don't have the knowledge of how to do that. And so when you are someone who strives for perfection and puts it on yourself, and yet are trying to do that during a time where you're just flying by the seat of your pants, and you feel like maybe you can't support your family enough or support your team enough, then I do see how that even piles on even more. And being able to reframe that and to kind of give yourself that support that you need is a really important skill to master. I wanted to end by learning a little bit more about you, sharing some information on who Chloe is. And so would you mind answering the following little lightning round with just a couple words? Are you an introvert or an extrovert?
Right in the middle.
I actually love this question because we get such varied responses, but it's something I think many of us think a lot about, and particularly in this time when we're, confined to our homes. What's your favorite day of the week?
I like Mondays a lot. I know that sounds weird, but the energy to me of the whole week just feels so fresh and everything's just waiting to get started.
You are, I think, one of the first people to say Mondays, but I do appreciate that, especially after this conversation and knowing more about, some of those techniques for approaching the week and time and progress. Are you an early bird or a night owl?
Totally early bird. I'm up at like sometimes 4:35, 6. But then by like 6 p.m., I'm useless.
Who would be your dream dinner guest?
I think Sally Krawcheck. I'd love to have dinner with Sally.
Oh, Sally is a fantastic dinner guest, and
I bet.
she's amazing. What is your pet peeve?
People who talk on cell phones in elevators, I can't stand it.
my, my my husband and I were just talking about this over the weekend, because we had been somewhere and people were having a conversation and it was like really loud, and we couldn't like stop listening to them, because it was like sort of invading our sound space. And he said that yes, he has a pet peeve of people speaking in elevators too and being really loud. Do you have a morning staple, something you need to get your day started off on the right track?
Vodka? No, I'm just kidding. Obviously, coffee, 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 coffee.
That's awesome. That's so good. I didn't expect that. That was good. Your favorite recent read?
I would say by Kate Northrup. She wrote a book called Do Less a couple years ago, and I just discovered it. Do Less is a great book for working moms.
Okay. It sounds like I need to read that. What is your top self-care practice?
I would say long hot showers. They're always available. You always kind of feel a little bit productive afterwards. It's always good to be clean. And then they actually really stimulate the vagus nerve. So they are super relaxing. I love a good long hot shower like every single day, at least once.
And can you share with our listeners how to find your book and when it's coming out?
Yeah, definitely. So Amazon, anywhere books are sold, or you can go to nervousenergybook.com.
Excellent. Dr. Chloe, thank you so much for joining us today on the Ellevate podcast. It was wonderful to spend time with you again and to learn from all of your insights and experience.
Right back at you, Kristy. It was great to chat with you.
Thanks so much for listening to Ellevate. If you like what you hear, help a girl out. Subscribe to the Ellevate podcast on iTunes. Give us 5 stars and share your review. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Ellevate NTWK, that's Ellevate Network, and become a member. You can learn all about membership and all the great things that Ellevate Network is doing at our website, www.ellevatenetwork.com. That's ELLEVATE network.com. And special thanks to our producer, Catherine Heller. She rocks. And to our voiceover artist, Rachel Griesinger. Thanks so much, and join us next week.
92% of households that start the year with Peloton are still active a year later.
92% because of a bike?
Not just bikes. We also make treadmills and rowers.
Oh, let me guess, for elite athletes only, right?
Nope. It doesn't matter if you're an avid exerciser or new to working out. Peloton can help you achieve your fitness goals. 92% stick with it. So can you. Try Peloton bikes, tread, or row risk-free with a 30-day home trial. New members only. Not available in remote locations. See additional terms at onepeloton.com/home-trial.